Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Richa Kaul, the CEO and founder of Complyance. Richa, thank you so much for taking time to chat.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Could you give us a brief introduction about you and your company before we actually get into the topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about me, come from more of a consulting and public sector background. I have kind of a personal reason though for loving compliance. I'm a bit of a data privacy nut. In my personal life, I am very particular about making sure that companies, governments don't have more of my data than they need. And so started Compliance as a way to more efficiently protect everyone's personal data by helping enterprises keep consumer data safe.
That's a great introduction. And you said you're based out of London. And I'm not surprised because I think when it comes to data compliance and sensitivity around data, I mean, as somebody who has a few products and, we have to do all of these things for compliance. I know GDPR as for a startup is not an easy thing to understand. So I can appreciate that, somebody who's located in that part of the world probably, uh, you know, uh, is more sensitive to data, right? I think in the US, it's just my opinion. I feel like we are more open to sharing information. I'll share a quick anecdote, right? I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, uh, it was actually a true story with he was talking to somebody who was Gen Z and, they were asking, hey, do you want this is exaggerated, but it's not totally deviant from the truth. They're like, hey, do you want a tall or a latte coffee or something at Starbucks? And then if you ask the person, can I get your social? They would actually be, yeah, sure, why not? Right? So it didn't matter that they were actually buying coffee. It's preposterous that they were more than willing to share all kinds of private data. And now, we have to sort of educate the younger generation that, what? Coffee was an exaggeration, but the real story was not far fetched from that preposterous example, right? So I think I just want to share that. I thought it was as ridiculous as it was. I wasn't surprised because I feel like I read that more and more of the next generation is willing to just dish out data as long as you ask them a question. Hey, what's your date of birth, or what's this, or what's that? It's something I noticed in the Jimmy Kimmel show as well. But I'm deviating. Sorry. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to do a quick screen share of your company so you can talk. Just give us an intro to that as well, and then we can jump into the topic. So let me pull up your screen here.
Sure. And I'm happy to share a little bit as you're doing that. I think that going back to the mission, it's about helping enterprises really keep customer data safe by using AI and automation in a tailored way to manage their information security compliance and data privacy compliance. And I think we have to be very realistic when it comes to enterprises and how much they care about information security. Oftentimes their GRC teams, they really care. They really care about compliance and security. But many times, sometimes, executive teams, boards, they want to make sure that there's balance between the costs required to manage compliance and the outcomes. And so, compliance teams don't get endless budgets because they're often thought about as a cost center. And how do you create scalable, tailored compliance automation for these enterprises that has a dual benefit? It keeps customer data safe without breaking the bank. And it starts to turn the GRC team into a value center by reducing risk materially for the business. And that is the kind of dual-pronged approach that we take. And the actual tech, what does it do? It supports compliance management, audit prep, risk management, policy management, third-party risk management, and trust management.
Perfect. And I'm going to take some notes as we go so I can have follow-up questions. I'm all right doing one of two things, which is talking to a person or taking notes. Doing both at the same time, that's not my forte. So sometimes, that's a challenge, but I'm going to do it to the extent because I need to capture some things so I can have a follow-up conversation around that. So, and I might ask you for the same thing more than once. My apologies. Yeah.
No problem.
One of the things you mentioned was compliance as a cost center, right? I want to start there, but before we go there, just to set the foundation, this compliance is an expensive proposition. By expensive, I mean it does cost money, right? So which means your clients, I'm presuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, and just give us a brief introduction to the type of company that you work with. Are these like large enterprises, like, maybe mid-sized, maybe really large companies who can actually afford to spend dollars on compliance?
Yes. So I think I want to rephrase the point slightly. It is expensive to not invest in compliance. It is much less expensive to invest in proactive compliance. That being said, of course, you have to always risk assess and risk weight the investment that you're making. So, a smaller company like a startup probably isn't going to be spending big dollars on compliance because, frankly, while of course they're always at risk for a data breach or a hack, in reality, they're probably not a likely target. And so their risk is reduced. Therefore, of course, to offset the risk, they spend less money. If you think about bigger companies, and I'm talking even mid-market companies, they are at direct risk of data breaches. They have more third parties, so they're at risk of data breaches driven by third parties. And every single time that you have additional risk added, the cost of proactively addressing that risk gets more and more appetizing and more useful. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say, linking actually relatively small costs to the value that it provides the business is just the beginning of starting to transform that conversation from a purely, this is added cost to, no, this is added value that we need to actually prevent costs in the future.
Okay, fair points, right? Let me ask you. So it is expensive, meaning what you're saying is it's there is dollars to be spent on being compliant, but from a quote unquote expense standpoint, it's less expensive to be compliant because you don't want to get sued for millions of dollars because you are not compliant, rather than spend a much smaller percentage of that amount upfront to be proactive in being compliant, right? That's what you're trying to say there. So if I understood it correctly, let me just go one step further. What are the size of these? What is the typical size of companies that you expect or do you work with? Because I'm asking this as a startup, right? Where, when you have $2, you have to get things that are $10 worth done, and you don't even have those $2 to begin with. So as important as some of these things are, you cut corners not because you have to cut corners. You cut corners because you just don't know how else to do things. But that is the premise. What are the typical sizes of companies that you work with, or companies such as yourself might typically work with?
Yeah. So we actually work with companies that are ranging from about 100 million in revenue all the way up to actually Fortune 100s. There are a couple linkages that create the kind of ideal client for us. But we have clients across the board from actually, we have major league sports leagues in the US. We have Fortune 10 clients, Fortune 100 clients. We support a lot of healthcare organizations and hospital systems across the world. So we have clients who, again, common thread, they really care about compliance. That is where they are a perfect client. And of course, as I said, typically it's mid-market to enterprise. But the reason I want to call out some of the smaller end of that spectrum is because when you're even a startup or a smaller company in a very regulated industry, such as health tech, such as fintech, you actually start to see the exposure to more and more risk early on in the journey. And you care about compliance and security out of necessity more than a startup that, might be focused on retail tech or, more generalized SaaS, marketing tech, CRM, any of those kinds of things. And of course, they should all care too, but, the risk is higher, right? Like the consequences are higher. And so we actually see some more regulated industry companies come to us earlier in their journey because our tech is a lot more configurable, a lot more tailored than some of the kind of cookie cutter compliance automation that's out there. Does that make sense, Krish?
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. Yep. Not that I don't have questions, but it makes a lot of sense. Okay. So you said $100 million and then Fortune 100 companies as well, right? So what percentage of, if you have, if that's something that is of interest, what percentage of their revenue should they be typically spending on compliance? So if a company that makes $100 million, what is that number? Because I'm asking this completely honestly, being ignorant of what that number might even be.
Mm-hmm. So it's important to note that it's actually not linear, but the graph looks a little bit different than you would expect. rather than kind of curving this way, if that makes sense, it actually kind of curves this way. It is, of course, industry specific, but what we see is that actually the biggest companies spend the most per per revenue dollar, which isn't much, but per revenue dollar on compliance, because they are actually targeted the most, not only by hackers, but also in terms of fines. They also have the most third parties. So they have a sprawling kind of like web of risks that are hidden around, and they need to spend more money to keep those things in control. You said a little bit earlier on the interview that that the risk is about getting fined, right? Or getting
Right.
having more financial, like direct financial penalties of cybersecurity and data privacy. It's 100% true. But I think that the real cost actually comes not so much from the fines as from the amount of energy that is put in to handling a breach or handling a security incident while it's happening. It draws up, like, zaps energy from multiple different executive level folks from different teams. It can affect customers, and that starts to affect your sales. Those are the real financial costs that I think people feel. Though, of course, fines are getting higher and higher. So that is also a very real consequence as well.
Okay, so and what would that percentage be, Richa? So let's say if it's $100 million in revenue, are we talking 1% of that revenue being spent on compliance, or are we talking like 10%, or what is that number?
No, so I think at the lower end, when you're looking at that curve, at the lower end, you're realistically talking about probably it's a very small fraction. It's probably less than 0.1% that is being spent on compliance activities. And I think that number, again, kind of starts to increase as you go up the chain, but it becomes very industry specific. So it's hard to give a very specific range.
Oh, no, that gives me an idea. So if it's 0.1%, so what you're saying is if you chose not to invest that 0.1% upfront, depending again on the industry, and I have an interest in fintech and we'll come to that shortly, you mentioned that the cost is twofold, right? One is the cost of the fines themselves directly as to what the government might fine you and whatnot. But two is the sunk cost, if you will, right? Meaning the teams that were working on something else now have to stop doing what they were doing. So there is a cost associated with that as well. I almost want to say that there's probably a third intangible cost, which is the trust that you end up losing, right? And again, some companies have to worry about that more so than others. I mean, I think there was a Microsoft breach or something not too long ago. And I think a couple of years ago, there was a CrowdStrike breach where the stock price plunged like 200 some dollars, and now they're up all the way back. But that's reputation at stake. But depending on the type of company you are, the industry you are in, and the types of clients you cater to, I'm presuming that some can recover faster than others. And I say this because CrowdStrike, I thought, recovered rather quickly, right? I mean, they went from actually getting beaten down almost a 50% to coming back to that number and higher. So there is a lot of cost. And so simply there is no alternative to having this. Any other downsides? We've covered these three. Anything else that somebody should be concerned about not spending enough time or money on compliance, Richa?
Yeah, I think I would add one, and then I want to talk about the trust one. So there is an element of peace of mind and control. And I think that it's at a younger company, at a startup, scale up, a founder. I understand the burdens of a founder very, very intimately. Of course, you have so much on your mind, so much, that worries you, that's keeping you up at night all the time. And it's commercial, it's funding, and a million things. What I find is that there is a peace of mind element to knowing that your software is secure, to knowing that your offering to your client is actually been pen tested, been really pressure tested against what could potentially be a leak, a breach, some issue in your code that's exposing data for clients unknowingly. These are things that I think actually have value. So that's kind of one piece of it. I want to share a controversial take on the trust point that you mentioned. I am finding that the more common that data breaches become, the less that trust is affected by a breach. Now, I don't think that is something that is necessarily breaking news. Like, we all know it. 10 years ago, if there was a big breach, it would be front page news. We would know about it. Think about the Experian breach that happened, right? Everyone knew about it. Breaches of that scale happen all the time these days, and it's not even newsworthy anymore. I think that in reality, if you look at stock prices now, they bounce back really fast. It's really crazy. Some of them barely take a hit after they've had a breach. Sometimes it's a really bad breach, like the Marks and Spencer breach recently, put their stores out of business for multiple days. People didn't stop going. They didn't really have, that much of a break in trust. I think that, in fact, it's almost the opposite. I think that demonstrating compliance proactively builds trust, and people are starting to understand that if you have a breach after you've done everything that you can do and you've tried to be proactive, then that is becoming the cost of doing business. And I don't say that as a way to excuse companies that are not protecting themselves enough. I say that in an effort to not what we call breach shame, because right now it's very, very difficult to cover every single eventuality. But if you have a proactive compliance approach, you build trust on the front end and you're more ready to deal with the consequences on the other side. And that limits the effect significantly of an issue. And again, I know I'm really in the weeds here, Krish, but this topic really matters to me because I think it's changing in front of our eyes and people are not really talking about it enough.
No, great point. So what you're saying is that also because of a cultural shift per se? Now, at the top of the our meeting here, I mentioned an example that I read where somebody was willing to dish out a social security number. And what you're telling me here, Richa, is that people are more willing. And I get a mail almost every other day saying, Chris, somebody has access to your date of birth. And my first thought these days when they see date of birth is not that my PII information is exposed. I'm like, oh my God, are they going to think I'm old? I'm just kidding, right? So yeah, my thought process, the whole thing is changing because it happens all the time. Like you're like, yeah, sure, they got it. What do we do now, right? So do you think it's what would you attribute that to? Like you compared to 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, if companies are able to recover from breaches without being impacted, without their stock prices plunging as much as they probably could or should, why do you think that's happening, Richa?
I've heard a bit of antipathy, towards the idea of people having one's data. So, for example, I'll tell my friends, don't you should reject cookies on every site that you go to. You should be careful of where you put your email address. What's the point? They have the data. The colloquial they have the data already. What's the point? Facebook already has my data. Instagram already has my data. And I think that in a world where ChatGPT knows everything about you, and you're seeing these perplexity browsers and all of these types of things that just know everything about you. And not only has that been somehow twisted into a positive, but you're also getting to a point where people are used to and exposed to their data being available and used, willy-nilly. And so they don't feel as much sensitivity about it. And that's a slippery slope. I mean, we can talk about this for a long time, but I think that that's why, that's really why we're seeing less care about these things, less consequences.
It makes sense, right? Because I have a friend who, his car got towed years ago, and we went to this towing place, and when you go to pick up your car once it's towed, it's not like going to a car showroom, right? That place doesn't look that great. It looks like a junkyard. So he had to pay like a couple $100 at the time. He was not even comfortable handing out his credit card to that company, just looking around how that place looked. On the other side, I'm a little bit easier going, if you will, in that sense. I would give it to anybody if they ask for the card. Because some of the differences I've noticed is you go eat in a restaurant in the US, and I know you said you're from here, you currently live, so you probably know both sides of the ocean here. You give the credit card and they take it, and then they come back to it, you sign, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you think about it. Whereas in Europe, at least in the little experience that I've had, they bring these devices to you. They don't even touch your credit card in a lot of the places, right? So to me, it's only, it's both the West. It's just one ocean in between, but there was a significant cultural difference, like completely different. I want to set the premise and ask you a couple of things. And then if you go, let's say my family lives back in India, if I try to explain this to my mom, I mean, she's very intelligent, but this is not something she would even understand. So, when you talk compliance, when you talk people who are sort of in that business or who are, I don't know, for lack of a better word, young enough, at least in the case of my mom, she wouldn't get the essence of this. So, you work with enterprises, so I don't know if it directly impacts you, but I just want to get your thoughts on how do you think that how do you think this is going to pan out? Because on one side, you have folks who are younger on TikTok and Instagram willing to give out this information voluntarily, right? Not thinking twice about should I give this. And on the other side of the demographic, you have somebody who may be conscious about not wanting to give it, except that they're not aware of what this even means, right? So if somebody asks them for this information, they genuinely believe that the person asking has good intent and they need this information. So, you have a wide range of people. And how does this compliance work with each of these segments and categories of people?
Yeah, I think that it is actually less about the consumers and more about the businesses. And the reason I say that is because I think that consumer knowledge about data privacy and information security has probably net increased, even if their maybe care about it is not increased very much or maybe even gone down. I don't think that 10, 15 years ago, people even necessarily understood the concept of data privacy. But now if you speak to, any Gen Z, I don't know about Gen Alpha yet, but Gen Z, person, they'll definitely know what a data breach is. They'll definitely understand what data privacy, roughly means. There's so much more regulation around it today, even in the US, that there's more protections in place. So I think that there's more fluency around it, though I agree, that care about it is not very high. But I think where the regulations really hold up and people care is when it comes to business relationships, because a business still, and actually increasingly so, does not want another business to be the reason that their customers' data was exposed, right? And so that matters to them a heck of a lot. They don't want to be telling their customers, oh, sorry, we actually got your data breached or leaked because of one of the vendors that we work with. And that expectation has actually solidified over time. And that is where I think a lot of the focus on information security is increasing. And I'll just give one last example on this point. In the EU, you mentioned GDPR is, of course, a regulation. Yes. But ISO 27001, NIST CSF, SOC 2, those are not mandated by any laws anywhere, soon to be Germany, but nowhere else, right? And they are a market expectation. Not even something that, even as a startup, you can't really get very far in selling to businesses without one of those. That's the power of market expectation and the expectation of business to business trust.
And do you see companies do the least minimum needed to satisfy the governmental regulations and requirements? Or do you see companies be more genuinely open to going over and beyond what's mandated?
Love this question, Krish. Thank you for asking it. This is a fun one. So I think that there is a spectrum of government regulation, and there is a spectrum of company approaches to that government regulation. What I mean by that is that, a lot of GDPR, whether we like it or not, is about the spirit of the regulation. If you actually deep dive the articles, which I have done, there is, of course, some very objective mandates that are required, but a lot of it is actually more about, I'm not going to say a promise, but kind of the spirit of data privacy. You can interpret the language and the letter of the law differently based on how much you care, right? And that's just a fact. When it comes to companies and how they approach compliance, our name is literally compliance with a Y, and our logo is actually a greater than symbol and a check to represent doing more than checking the box. And that's what we promise to our clients that we will help them achieve. So you're probably speaking to the wrong person, because when clients work with us, we have self-selected the ones who really care about compliance, which is how I started this conversation. and said when a client really cares about compliance, we are a perfect fit for them because we are very, very tailored in the way that we deliver compliance monitoring and checks across our platform. And I'll maybe explain that a little bit more, but does that answer the question?
Oh, that definitely answers the question. What I want to ask you is kind of shift gears a little bit, talk technology, right? Specifically, just to educate myself as to, okay, now I got a basic premise of what compliance is, why it's needed, how much companies are generally spending on it, where they stand, what services you provide, right? From a product standpoint. A couple of high level questions before we get a little bit deeper. Do you uh, provide compliance to companies using AI to help you provide better compliance? Or do you actually provide compliance to companies that are using AI to building their software, meaning that's one part of it? Or do you do both? I have more specific questions, but I want to just get a high level idea as to where in these three categories that you actually fit in.
Yeah, thank you. That was very missy, as we say in consulting. We do, it's a third one. We do both. And so it is not important to us what the company's product or services is. What's important to us is how much they care about being compliant and doing more than just checking the box against the market expectations and regulations that they deal with every day.
Okay. So let's say I'm a company that is in the fintech space, right? So we do a few things. One of the things we do, Richa, is publish APIs on AWS Marketplace. We are currently starting to work on a fintech API and a product, right? So this is the first time we're doing something in that space. Typically, our APIs are horizontals. And as we've talked to more people in New York City, like the exchanges, it's been super overwhelming because, as a startup, we are used to having an idea and starting to write code, right? That's just the way we've rolled in the past. Right or wrong, that's just the way our culture has been. With the fintech product, we recognize that there is a whole lot more we have to do, both in terms of affordability and knowledge before we can actually even get started with doing something, right? So with that said, let's say when somebody's working on something or somebody's built something and coming to you saying, Richard, can you help us either tell where we lack compliance or how we should be compliant, right? Here is my initial thought, and if you could just walk us through that. My initial thought is, you're going to be like, Krish, what do you guys do? Which industry are you in? Whether it's health tech, fintech, something else. You mentioned there are industries where compliance is probably, it's not unimportant. It's not necessarily just as important as some other industries, right? So, like, what would your process be once you find out what the client does? Depending on what that industry is, like fintech, health tech, and whatnot, do you go find out what compliance, what requirements they need to actually follow? And if that's the list, how do you go about telling if they are not compliant? And what does that process look like? And then we can jump into more specific technology. But I just want to get into that space.
Yeah, great. So this is a slightly different case because it's a younger company in a very regulated space. In this case, I actually would almost recommend check the box compliance on our side because it is not, again, you always want to make sure that it's risk assessed, right? Like you want to make it make sense from a risk perspective. If the risk is not immediately very high, then the first step is about checking the boxes. And then we can later get to a point where we're doing more than checking the boxes. So right away, it's very simple from that perspective to say, hey, here are the requirements or here are the standards that you must comply with based on your industry, where you're based, and so on. We have all of these requirements actually off the shelf. And what we've done is we've used a combination of domain-trained AI as well as actual auditor and consulting expertise to change or, translate some of the requirements into plain English so that it becomes very clear, not only what does the requirement say, but also what do you need to provide to prove that you are actually compliant with this requirement. And all of that is listed out for you in literally in a list. You can click into one, you get basically a page that pops up and it goes through, explains to you what is required, what evidence to provide. It maps back to the criteria of the regulation, and then you can actually go and drag and drop or integrate directly to provide that evidence that's required for that requirement.
Okay. So the next question I have is, so you said that there's legal terms and terminologies, right? That it's very hard to understand. You have a process to sort of translate that legal language or verbiage to more plain and simple English terms, right? Once it's translated in that language, I'm asking this question as a developer. Even that English language is just as difficult almost as a legal language if you give that to a developer, because they're like, hey, you know what, I have these list of points, I understand the statements, the sentences, but I still don't know how to tie that into the product that we actually sell. So how does that, what is the bridge between we went from the legal language to the rather simplified version that's in English. But how do you go from English to, okay, what does Snowpal do? What their products are? What does their code look like? And how do you identify the lack of compliance between those English sentences in their document or wherever it is to the product suite of that company, right? That the company offers. Let's say the company has only one product, not even a suite. What's the bridge between the two?
Yeah. So for different requirements, where they are based on, let's say, code, or where they're based on other, um, you know, tools as the source of truth, we're actually able to integrate with that tech stack and create, or actually provide off the shelf, and then you can configure it further, custom checks that essentially check the compliance at the source. So for example, we can integrate, with GitHub or GitLab and actually do checks on the code and some of the security configurations related to the code, as well as, checking for things like Dependabot being there and so on, to basically ensure that the implementation of the compliance requirement is in place without someone having to understand and then apply that knowledge to the specific system.
Okay, so I want to dig a little bit deeper, as deep as we can go in the time that we have in the next few minutes. Is this can be very complex, I reckon, because the tech stack is even as a small company, we have like we are a polyglot shop with a number of languages and frameworks and dependencies and whatnot. So even if you just took one startup that had like, I don't know, 6 different languages and a number of different technology stacks, I'm just trying to think how this is very interesting and complex at the same time, right? Because you have to use some of these tools. You mentioned Dependabot, a lot of these tools that you can integrate to tell what's happening and what's not happening. But as a company that builds software, we typically have some of those engineering compliance dependencies, if there's even a right combination of words, in place, right? Like we would have those tools to tell if the libraries that we're using and the versions of those libraries are actually compliant, or if they have security vulnerabilities. But where we seem to lack, at least personally speaking, is what the government requires. It's beyond what these libraries might actually track. I know this could be a little abstract, but does that kind of make sense what I'm trying to ask there?
Yes, but what I would say is that it's, again, let's go back to what I said about the letter of the law, right? A lot of these standards are not so prescriptive that they're trying to um, go that far beyond some of the security best practices that that a typical engineering team would find. I think it's about making sure that the scope of those is complete, that they're applied regularly, that you are actually following the recommendations, that you're kind of actioning the findings. Those are very genuinely a lot more of what these standards are testing for. But I do think that in your question, therein lies a common misconception and one of the big issues of information security. It feels like a burden and it feels so confusing and heavy because most of the time we let it feel that way, right? Like we don't make it practical. We don't say, how can we apply this standard in a way that works for our business, rather than making it feel like some unattainable, perfect standard. When I've read a lot of these standards, it genuinely is not asking for that, right? It's asking to say, you don't need to have vulnerability free code. You need to have something in place that checks for vulnerabilities. When there are vulnerabilities of a certain criticality, they need to be addressed in a timely manner, and we need to be able to prove that they were addressed in a timely manner. That is a much more practical approach to the real world than feeling like everything has to be perfect all the time. I think that the gap there is one of the problems with information security today, where folks in InfoSec, GRC don't necessarily always translate the real world version of some of those standards to their teams. And so it ends up feeling too heavy, too far from reality. And then it ends up being almost, I don't want to say deprioritized, but I mean, a lot of engineers I know kind of feel like, oh, compliance is such a pain, or, I don't want to deal with this audit prep or things like that. And this is why. I don't know, Krish, what do you think? And what's your experience been?
No, I think it's right because, to take that further, Richa, even as a developer, we think even fixing bugs is a pain because, unless you're building new features that can improve the quality of your product, everything else seems like a waste of time, right? If you had asked me 3 years ago, Krish, what is the only thing that's important to run a company? It would have taken me less than 2 seconds to tell me, Richa, of course, it's code that you have to write and it actually is executed by the machine. But 3 years down the road or 5 years down the road, I feel deep down as complicated technology is not particularly easy, right? But I genuinely believe every other role in the company is either just as important or in a lot of scenarios more important than a developer's role. And when I talk to other developers today who have not actually either started a company just as yet or happen to be in the space of writing code, they genuinely believe that is the most difficult thing to do. And I tell them, you know what? If you think writing code, I'm even talking pre-AI or pre-Copilot or pre-vibe coding days. I tell people, if you think coding is even remotely difficult, try selling the code that you wrote. Then tell me if coding is difficult or if the selling part is difficult, because as somebody who didn't understand sales, it's very challenging. I would have been ignorant, saying, you know what? Yeah, we build great software. Somebody's going to break through our front door, grab it, and go. Right? Why do I have to do any selling at all? Till you build it and then put it out there, and then you recognize that OMG, right? Looks like this world is a large place, and then you have to start learning other things about things that you're not comfortable doing. I think
Yeah.
compliance is I see it akin to that because you mentioned, right, it is expensive to not be compliant, period. You're going to be pulled back. And I don't know what it means. Like if you took CrowdStrike as an example, I'm just speculating here. Sure, their stock price came back up, but if they didn't have that violation or what is it, the breach to begin with, perhaps they may have been in a slightly different place for all we know, right? So it is certainly important to get that done. The one thing I do want to ask you is, uh, the technology part of it, right? Richa, if you could just educate me and us in this process, because when you go from one stack to another, even as a polyglot engineer, there's a certain mental adjustment that we have to make. Because a lot of times I end up writing Ruby code like Golang and code like TypeScript or something, because you've just been doing that the last 3 days and you change gears and you recognize you're not doing it right. As a company that's on the outside, you have to go in ignorant to begin with because you don't know what the company's products and code bases look like. How is that journey of, hey, you know what? There are 15 things the company does. I need to break it down to one at a time. And I need to have a team around this to go about assessing their compliance, identifying discrepancies and violations, potential breaches, prioritize what's more important, what's less important from your perspective, from a regulation perspective, but also from a client perspective. Because you could say, Krish, this is so important, you need to fix this. I could be like, Richard, this is not even an important feature for us, so we'll drop it. Fixing it is more expensive than dropping it, right? So how does that relationship work between your company and a client? Because their sizes vary, their technology varies, the industry varies, and I can just see how quote unquote simple your job can be. So please educate us as to what the journey could be.
Great. Just want to really keep in mind that we are a software provider, not a services provider. And so we really tee up a client to be able to deal with some of this on their own. And that is actually the power of not only AI, but of the custom approach that we have taken to our platform and the level of configurability that we provide. So as an example, in a lot of platforms that were around before us, everything was very cookie cutter. There would be a requirement, and then there would be a fixed standard compliance check that ran for that requirement. As you just explained, that doesn't work. And those companies are still doing it that way today, by the way. And maybe it solves 50, 60% of any given company's, compliance needs, but it can't go the 100%. because the way that we manage compliance is different from you, is different from the next company, different from the next company, right? It's just because our products are different. So obviously the way that we manage our security and privacy has to be different. And so it's actually about creating a custom compliance agents, custom integrations, which we have built in a very modular way to be able to be customized. And what that does is it allows you to set up your own custom compliance tests. So you see the requirement, you understand, okay, this is where the data is, and you can kind of tune the compliance check barometer to where it needs to be for your org. You can create custom criteria, custom compliance checks, tests for your org, and even rank them. Like, oh, this is going to be, this is a high level issue. This is actually kind of a low level issue if it comes up. So that is actually one of our unique value propositions in the market is custom compliance.
Perfect. We got about 10 minutes or so, right, to go, maybe 15 tops. I want to switch gears. So this is great, the whole conversation. Thank you. But I want to kind of completely shift gears from compliance, from Richa, from what you guys do, from what we do, and talk about something a bit more generic, right? So apologies for the dramatic shift in topic here, but it's important because it's something that's of interest to not just our audience, but people in general. Let's talk about AI, right? Let's talk about the impact. Let's talk about folks getting into the workforce. Let's talk about some of those things, right? That people are generally curious about. The first question. So treat this as like a rapid fire 10, 15 minutes, Richa. I just want to get your thoughts and I want to go through a list of these. I haven't jotted these questions down, so I'm just going to throw them out as they come in no particular order. The first thing is as you work solving problems that you are doing on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, how much has AI changed the way you do things? Is it 100%? Is it 80%? Is it 50%? Is it 10%?
The way that I personally do things as I'm working through everyday life.
You and your team, sort of, in solving and approaching, going about solving problems and the functionality that Complyance as company provides, right? Just if you were to just summarize it for your company, yeah.
We all have a mandate set by me, our COO, and our CTO to use AI every single day. And it should be used in not only every function, but in every workflow where we feel that there's repeatable manual tasks that are taking up too much time. So in that sense, I would say that AI is used in a lot of what we do, and it should be, because it's essentially a force multiplier as of now. And it allows you to do much more work than you could do before. It allows you to check and create and pressure test in ways that we haven't been able to do with so much frequency and at such speed. And so it's a really important tool. The reason I asked the question is because I think underlying it is something that I'm worried about, which is that it is at its core an input. And I think that a lot of folks that are younger in their careers right now are over relying on it as as a core rather than as just an input to what they really think and believe and put forward. And I'm worried about that, which is a whole can of worms conversation, but I just thought I would bring it up as you.
No, that's actually an important point, and that is one of the things I was going to ask you, just not in that order. But since you mentioned that, let's talk about that. And a quick background is, let's say, calculators. Let me take a preposterous example. When you go to the grocery store or when you talk to a realtor, when you're looking for a house, they had these percentages as to what your, borrowing rates should be and whatnot. And I would, we were taught to just do this mental math growing up in India. It was just convenient, right? It's not because we didn't have calculators. I mean, sure, we have had calculators for as long as they've been around. But my realtor had asked me at the time saying, it's interesting that you want to do all of this sort of in your mind to get to these numbers. Like what is the 1.3% borrowing on $175,000 or something along those lines? You've got the calculator, so you should just use it, right? That's a better way of doing it. I've never come to terms with that because I actually think pulling my phone out and using the calculator to actually arriving at that approximate number to having those conversations is actually detrimental to my progress and productivity, despite the fact that the calculator is a better tool, right? It does it more accurately, because sometimes you don't need those levels of accuracies. You just need the speed at which you're able to make those decisions. With that, if that makes sense, or with that in mind, my concern with AI, with some other examples which I can share here as well, Richa, is does it take away our intellect that we are born with, the thought processes, and are we beginning to rely more and more on machines, which is fine in one sense because they're supposed to do things better and faster and nicer and thinner and with all those Apple type of adjectives. But does it make us poor in actually becoming problem solvers? And if that's true or false, I want to get your thoughts as the first part of the question. The second part is, if we become lesser problem solvers by virtue of relying on these tools, I feel like the only skill that we can have to compete against robots or any kind of bots and automation and AI is the ability to think independently to solve problems better. If we end up losing that skill as well, what are we left with to actually being able to compete, right? So I just want to get your thoughts on both of those.
Yeah, I'm honestly most worried, Krish, about the younger generations, because they are growing up right now with AI and that next level of tech available to them, to the degree that they're not building the foundational skill sets themselves necessarily, right? And I think that that is actually the most concerning. I think for those of us who have, been lucky enough to grow up building those skill sets and have, entire careers before AI came forward, and where we had to really do a lot of thinking and pushing for ourselves. I think we've built up so much muscle that it's going to take years, if not generations, for it to go, to fall to the wayside. Although there is, the scary level of tech reliance, which is a sort of a separate conversation. When it comes to kind of the degradation of our problems, our own problem solving, because we're relying on AI, I think that I'm worried about the fact that folks are entering the workplace, or they're entering their first professional years of their career with ChatGPT available to them to answer every question. And the reality is that without experience and real world muscle getting built up, you can't check ChatGPT. Like you don't have the pattern recognition or the exposure to pressure test what ChatGPT is saying to you. And so then you're taking it, again, not just as one input, which I feel lucky to have the ability to do, to be honest. Not just taking it as an input, but maybe taking it at its word. And I think that that's where you start to get into a scary territory, because we don't want ChatGPT thinking for us. I really see the value of it being an input, though. But again, I was lucky enough to have built up a lot of problem-solving skill sets during my time at McKinsey. It was pressure tested well into the night every single day. And so I feel like I really appreciate it. That's kind of my thoughts on it. I don't know what you think about that, Krish.
Makes sense, but let's say you graduated from high school yesterday. Let's say Richa graduated from high school on November 4th. Would Richa sign up to go to college for a 4-year degree in 2025?
It's a really good question. Now, Richa would, because that was what I was excited about. But I think, I have to ask, is college the answer? I don't know. I think that's a whole other question, right? Like, is maybe like apprenticing actually a better answer in this new world where maybe, some of that knowledge is available? I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. And I think that the liberal arts degrees actually start to become more interesting in college, because they teach you more reasoning and they teach you more, problem solving. Whereas some of the hard skills, it may be better to go maybe a different route. I mean, this is again a big can of worms, but I just want to. I wish that I could really help talk to more young people about the value of building up those skill sets on their own and not using the faster, easy way that is available to them so readily right now with AI and tech.
Okay, and what should the moat? I know we got 4 minutes. What should the moat of or or the unique selling propositions of somebody who's graduating with a high school or college or early years of their career be today, because 10, 15 years ago, if you're a developer, if you wrote code better than somebody else, you had something that you could sell. If you could write documentation better, you could do it. You're more creative, that could be a selling point. Now a lot of these tools do a lot of that work. So what is it that you think, a role agnostic question, how can each of those individuals actually be better? Because if Richa and Krish are both using ChatGPT, Copilot, and everything else that's out there, what can separate the two of us?
Yeah. I'm going to give you a pithy answer here. I think it is problem solving, communication, and authenticity. And I've thought about this a lot because we are hiring on every team right now at Complyance, and everyone has access to the same ChatGPT as the next person. So now when I'm hiring, I need to think about these three things. Are they effective at problem solving? Are they able to communicate in a meeting to a client with the team? And are they authentic? And does that shine through?
I absolutely love those 3 points. Lovely. I mean, I think those are three bullets that, I mean, if you had to pick the best three, I feel like those could very well be. I think that is actually very, very nice. So thank you for sharing that. So as we come to the tail end of this, Richa, I have a non-technical question that I typically ask of a fair number of my guests. Before I go there, any questions that you have for me?
Just Krish, this has been such a pleasure, and I would ask just a little bit around, as you speak with these guests and get to learn a little bit more from every guest that you have. What are some of the learnings about AI that have really stuck out to you in the last year?
Do you have 5 minutes?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Brevity is not my forte, and I love talking. So the combination of those two things mean that it's very hard to end the conversation. I work from home too, so hardly see anybody. I'll answer the question based on two sets of experiences. One is working, or three actually, right? One is working for Snowpal, building products, right? That gives me a set of experiences. Talking to experts such as yourself on the podcast is enriching and gives me a different set of experience. And the third part is I go to a lot of the conferences in DC. We are a startup with limited ad budget. And when that's the case, you have to create content as well, right? So I try to find every occasion to create content. So I have to randomly walk the streets of DC in the hope that I stumble into somebody who's important. And you may or may not be surprised that DC has that opportunity. I actually can guarantee that I'll run into somebody and have a chat or a quick selfie with them. So these are three ways, and I go to these conferences, my team and I. Here's what I've learned by going to a recent conference where they had like about hundreds of Fortune 500 CEOs. There's a small room, they come and talk for 20 minutes and you can hear it from the horse's mouth as to what this means. Here's my take. When I went to the same conference a year ago, Richa, a lot of companies were beginning to invest heavily in the space of AI, but they did not have actual numbers, whether they could share or otherwise, as to what the ROI on those investments were. They were like, hey, we're throwing money or we're putting money in there. Things hopefully work out all right. 6 months down the road, when I went to the same conference, and 1 year down the road, it's a different set of founders, but they were all really large companies, right? You're talking like hundreds of billions of dollars, people running these companies. They were able to actually respond and answer to the return on investment on their investments, which to me was a dramatic shift in a 6 month time frame where they were just putting money in there. Now they're able to actually say, I'm getting some value back. Now, as to how much value they're getting, that I think depends on the company. Like, Meta plunged like 14% last week because, Mark Zuckerberg has been spending hundreds of billions of dollars. I think the next year's capex is going to be like $100 billion or more. And that's a cost center for them, right? That's not they're not making money directly through AI, unlike Microsoft or Google or other companies or Amazon. They're just using AI to make their engagements better. They increase engagement with the users and increasing the ad revenue and the context sensitivity of those ads and where they're placed. So if Meta can be punished for spending $100 billion when they've actually had a great quarter, it begs the question as to what this could possibly mean. You have one side where people believe that Nvidia is going to be a $10 trillion company in 12 to 24 months, and maybe so. I mean, Jensen Huang is capable of doing that, right? If you hear him talk, you're like, yep, if I have to put my money somewhere, it could be on him. At the same time, the rate of adaptability of AI tools in companies by people, Richa, from what I've seen directly and indirectly, has not been anywhere near the pace at which these investments seem to be made by these large organizations. Because we as humans have muscle memory, and they say, right, even if you have 10 women, you can't have a child in 1 month, right? It takes 10 months to have a baby. So I think there is this time that we need to digest these tools to see what makes sense, because there's a lot of companies that are in the business of providing AI. I reckon 75 to 85% of these companies may not even exist in the next 3 years, right? Because everybody's throwing money out there. So as a company that's using AI, that's leveraging AI or providing AI based tools, I feel like the onus is on the leaders or whatnot, whoever you call them, to pick the right set of tools. And to me personally, I'll end my answer with that's been the biggest challenge. Picking the right set of tools on AWS or outside of it or another Google or cloud, any other platform. So we know that that's what's going to help us in the next 3 to 6 months to a year to two. It's been very, very hard because as a startup, I know that we commit to a tool. We don't have the luxury to get out of that tool 6 months down the road. That'd be a lot of time and money and everything wasted. So I think while on one side, AI is definitely helping productivity, on the other side, it's actually killing productivity because some of us have to stop what we are doing to just be sure that we are picking the right set of tools, technologies, and frameworks for the next year, 2 or 5 years to come, which we didn't have to do a year or two ago. So I think the companies that I see being successful are not just ones who are going to drink the Kool-Aid of every AI tool that's out there, but trying to find a curated set of tools that make the most sense for your company and your people and your team and your clients. Because sometimes you could be spending a lot of money on an Nvidia chip, but you could be spending a lot less money on an AMD chip, as just a random example there, right? The fact that they're Dr. Su and Jensen Huang are cousins is a good thing to know, but doesn't make any difference to this conversation. But I mean, does some of that ramble make sense, Richa?
Yeah, and I feel it myself. I think you're right. In some ways, we're just spending a lot of time thinking about prepping for choosing, the horses that might win the race. And it is, you're right. I've actually not heard somebody say that, is AI actually creating a hit to productivity because we're all wrapped up in figuring out and spending so much time thinking about, how it's going to affect us, if we're betting on the right horse, tooling. And yeah, I agree. Thanks for sharing
I'm
that,
gonna,
Fred.
no worries. I'm gonna ask you to share your closing comments. But my last non-technical question to you was going to be, what's your favorite food? Like, you know what I mean? If you have to eat something, comfort food, what's that single dish that you would go to? Just one. You only get to pick one.
Pasta, probably cacio e pepe pasta.
You're gonna have to explain that not just to me. Our audience is mostly in the US and Europe, but there are people in Asia and Southeast Asia as well. I understood the pasta part, but not anything that followed that.
Cacio e pepe is basically oil, cheese, and black pepper on pasta, and it tastes delicious. So that is probably my comfort food go-to type of pasta.
Oh, that's good. It's vegetarian, so that's good. I'm happy that I am vegetarian as well. So there is no sauce. There's no marinara sauce. You're just saying pasta and some oil, and you cook it essentially, right?
Cheese, black pepper. Yeah,
Okay,
I'm not a vegetarian, but I do love cacio e pepe.
perfect. Which I think is good. I eat the same thing just without the cheese, but I can totally see that, and which is good. I was going to, every time I ask people, I think they're going to say one of the things that I have in mind, maybe so, and it's completely different. I think it's like completely different. And if you want to know the the answer that I've gotten for the most part from the majority of my guests, whether they are in the US, in Europe, in Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, or in Australia, no matter where, the most common response has been sushi. Yeah, that's been, I
Really?
would say, of everybody. And as vegetarian, there's only like one or two sushis I could buy at Whole Foods, which is I don't like seaweed either. So we need to find one without the seaweed and without the fish. So there's like two tiny pieces of avocado and cucumber. And I'm like, really? Can this be called sushi? But sure, if that's what Whole Foods is calling it, I might just, accept it. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
it. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Just your closing comments and then we'll call it wraps.
Thanks, Krish. No, I've had a really wonderful conversation. It's really fun to talk about how AI is changing the world, why compliance matters, the reason that security should be more practical. So I've had a lovely conversation with you. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. And again, folks, we had a chat with Richa Kaul, the CEO and founder of Complyance. I will include the link. We'll include the link to Richa's LinkedIn profile and your company and anything else that you want for us to include on the podcast. So if you're looking to be compliant or you're looking to find out if you are compliant or if you should be compliant, which Richa says you probably should be, you know who to reach out to, right? So again, Richa, thank you very much for taking the time. Until next time. Thanks a lot.
Perfect. Thanks, Krish.